Hello, welcome to this second session of the summary of Charles Dickens' novel Pickwick Papers. Till now, we have seen that the Pickwickians, consisting of 4 members of the Pickwick Club, start a tour of the countryside of England outside the city of London. During the course of their journey, they have arrived at many places like Rochester, which has been their first destination. From Rochester, they travel to a nearby small town called Chatham. From Chatham, they go to Dingley Dell at the invitation of Mr. Wardle. From Dingley Dell, Mr. Pickwick and Mr. Wardle has to rush back to London in search of Rachel Wardle and Alfred Jingle. After rescuing Rachel Jingle from the clutches of Alfred Jingle by paying him £120, Mr. Pickwick and Mr. Wardle again go back to Dingley Dell. From Dingley Dell, Mr. Pickwick had to rush to a nearby small town called Cobham, because Tracy Tupman, disheartened, has already left for Cobham, and from Cobham they come back to the city of London, to the rented house, to the rented apartment of Mr. Pickwick. Excuse me. So, in this episode in the rented apartment, we have seen that a misunderstanding takes place because of Mrs. Bardell's misinterpretation of Mr. Pickwick's request to allow Sam Weller to stay in that household as his servant. For we have seen that Mrs. Bardell interprets Mr. Pickwick's request as a marriage proposal and hugs him. And at that time, both of them were embarrassed by the entry of the other 3 Pickwickians, Snodgrass, Tupman and Winkle. And at that moment, Mrs. Bardell pretends to be ill and she is taken to her room. And then Sam Weller arrives there, and Mr. Pickwick employs Sam Weller as his personal servant at the wages of £12 a year, in addition to 2 suits. Mrs. Bardell's confusion and misunderstanding is Dickens' way of exposing pretense of widows, the marriage-minded nature of widows. It becomes clear from the episode that Mrs. Bardell has been nourishing this secret desire to get married to Mr. Pickwick for some time. Her desire to improve her social status, her desire to go up the ladder of class, her social status, class status, her desire for class mobility, this influenced her to nourish this secret desire to get married to Mr. Pickwick. And the day Mr. Pickwick was explaining his plan to keep Sam Weller as his servant in that household, it suddenly flared up Mrs. Bardell's desire, and she took that excuse to misunderstand Mr. Pickwick's wish, and that embarrassing situation occurred. Dickens in this novel has criticized both individuals and social institutions. He has exposed the pretense of individuals and also the pretense and corruption of social institutions. In this Mrs. Bardell's misunderstanding episode, Dickens has not only criticized satirically exposed the personality of Mrs. Bardell as a widow who was harboring, who was keeping this secret desire to get married to a person to improve her social status. But this episode also shows Dickens's social satire, Dickens' satirical exposure of a social institution like that of marriage, because Mrs. Bardell desired, she, she expresses her desire to marry Mr. Pickwick only to improve her social status. There has been other instances in which Dickens exposes satirically the institution of marriage. In the episode of Tony Weller and Susan Weller marriage, it is shown that how Tony Weller is tricked by marriage license touts. He was fooled by marriage license touts, and ultimately the person Tony Weller has to marry Susan Weller. Before that, there is the episode of Alfred Jingle. Alfred Jingle has been able to purchase a marriage certificate to get married to Rachel Waddell. Here also, Alfred Jingle has no genuine reason to marry Rachel Waddell, but for the sole reason of getting money. So, mercenary motives, the desire for economic benefit, it inspires Alfred Jingle to propose marriage to Rachel Waddell. Through all these episodes, Charles Dickens exposes the hypocrisy of the institution of marriage in the contemporary England. After the Mrs. Bardell misunderstanding episode, the Pickwickians next travel to a nearby town named Eatanswill. A violent election was taking place in the town of Eatanswill between two political parties, the Blues and the Buffs. Although there was violent electioneering going on between the Blues and the Buffs, no genuine discussion of the real social issues was taking place. Instead, the politicians were using underhanded tactics, illegal means to win votes, to woo voters, to convince voters. They would bribe the voters. Sometimes they would drug the voters so that they cannot go for casting their votes, and sometimes they would even throw some of the voters into a canal. Somehow the voting election takes place, elections is completed, and the candidate of the Blues, Samuel Samke, ultimately wins the election. But it is he wins only because of the tricks played by his political party, the Blues. So, ultimately the Buff party is defeated. After the election gets over, the next day the Pickwickians attend a costume breakfast party. A fancy dress breakfast party was thrown by a lady named Mrs. Leo Hunter. Mrs. Leo Hunter claims herself to be a poetess. She has already written a poem, she claims, and the title of the poem is An Ode on an Expiring Frog. Mrs. Leo Hunter has written this poem, An Ode on an Expiring Frog. The Pickwickians attend the party wearing fancy dresses, costumes, except Mr. Samuel Pickwick. Mr. Snodgrass attends the party wearing the costume of a bandit, a soldier, although he is quite fat at almost 50 years of age. Mr. Snodgrass attends the party as a French poet, but he has never displayed the qualities of a poet. And Winkle attends the party wearing the costume as a sports person, but he has failed showing his sportsman spirit in all the occasions. We have already seen how he shot Mr. Tupman in the arm and injured him at Dingley Dell, and also during their first journey to Dingley Dell, Mr. Winkle desires his wish to ride a horse, but ultimately he is thrown off from the back by the horse. Although he is never able to show the spirit of a sports person, he wears the sportsman's costume and attends the fancy dress breakfast party thrown by Mrs. Leo Hunter. Mrs. Leo Hunter herself presents herself in the party, attends the party, appears in the party as Minerva in the costume design, wearing the costume of Minerva, the Greek goddess. After introducing the guests, Mrs. Leo Hunter introduces a special guest whom she names as Mr. Charles Fitch-Marshall. When Mr. Charles Fitch-Marshall starts speaking, the Pickwickians immediately recognizes that it is Mr. Alfred Jingle in disguise. And when Mr. Charles Fitch-Marshall, who is actually Mr. Jingle, recognizes Mr. Pickwick there, he immediately runs away and leaves that place. But the Pickwickians follow him, and by following Mr. Jingle, the Pickwickians arrive at Bury St. Edmunds, a new small town. So, the next adventure takes the Pickwickians to Bury St. Edmunds. There, the Pickwickians book rooms at an inn called the Angel. From there, they start their investigation to find Alfred Jingle. Meanwhile, Sam Weller meets a person called Job Trotter. Job Trotter has been appointed as a servant by Alfred Jingle, because Alfred Jingle has already become quite rich by receiving £120 from Mr. Wardle. He has now employed a servant whose name is Job Trotter. Job Trotter tells Sam Weller that he does not like his master Alfred Jingle. Job Trotter also tells Sam Weller that Alfred Jingle is planning to elope, planning to run away with a rich girl from a boarding school near St. Bury Edmunds in a village. So, this plan of Alfred Jingle is revealed to Sam Weller by Alfred Jingle's own servant, Job Trotter. When Sam Weller gets to know about this plan of Alfred Jingle to run away with this girl from the boarding school from a nearby village, Sam immediately informs this to Mr. Pickwick. Mr. Pickwick now takes upon the responsibility on himself to save that girl, and that day he plans to visit the boarding school during the evening, and he planned he plans to catch Alfred Jingle red-handed. He plans to catch Alfred Jingle in that very act of eloping itself. While he climbed up above the wall and jumped into the campus of the boarding school, and he is waiting for Alfred Jingle to come there, a heavy shower erupts, a heavy shower starts. And to save himself from the rain, Mr. Pickwick goes near to the hostel room and starts knocking at the door. The door is opened by the girls inside, and they were horrified by the presence of Mr. Pickwick. They think that Mr. Pickwick is a thief, is a person of wicked nature. They immediately start shouting. The teachers also arrive, and they put Mr. Pickwick in a closet. They almost arrest Mr. Pickwick. Mr. Pickwick pleads with them and explains that he is not a person of bad nature, of bad intention. He explains that his friends are all staying in the nearby inn called the Angel. Some people are sent to the Angel Inn, and Sam Weller is brought there to the school, and then Mr. Pickwick is rescued from there. So, in this episode also, Alfred Jingle is able to fool Mr. Pickwick with the help of his servant Job Trotter. Actually, Job Trotter and Alfred Jingle planned the whole episode, and Job Trotter planted this story in the mind of Sam Weller, so that Sam Weller would narrate this story to Mr. Pickwick, and ultimately Mr. Pickwick is fooled, cheated in this whole episode. After this fiasco, after this confusing episode, Mr. Pickwick, Sam Weller, and the other members of the Pickwick Club, they now return to London. When Mr. Pickwick returns to London, he is informed that a case has been filed against him by Mrs. Wardle. Mrs. Bardell, his landlady, has filed a case against him, claiming £1,500 as compensation for breach of promise of marriage. A law firm called Dodson and Fogg has already sent a notice to Mr. Pickwick about this claim of £1,500 as damage for the breach of promise of marriage by Mr. Pickwick. Mr. Pickwick gets very angry coming to know about this lawsuit filed by Mrs. Bardell. After coming out of the office of the law firm of Dodson and Fogg, Mr. Pickwick and Sam Weller start walking around in the city of London. And while they visit an inn in the city of London, there they meet Sam Weller's father, Tony Weller. And Tony Weller informs them that a few days back he has carried Alfred Jingle to the nearby city of Ipswich. Tony Weller, Sam Weller's father, is a cabman, a coachman. He is a driver of a coach, a horse-drawn carriage, and he has taken Alfred Jingle and Job Trotter to Ipswich a few days back. This information now he gives to Mr. Samuel Pickwick. Mr. Samuel Pickwick, after coming to know about Alfred Jingle's possible presence at Ipswich, immediately plans his next adventure to Ipswich. During their journey to Ipswich, in the coach of Mr. Tony Weller, Mr. Pickwick meets a gentleman called Mr. Peter Magnus. Mr. Peter Magnus is also travelling to Ipswich with a special purpose. He tells Mr. Pickwick that he is going to Ipswich to propose to a lady. The Pickwickians and Mr. Peter Magnus, they stay in the same lodge, in the same inn that night. And that lady whom Peter Magnus is going to propose, she is also staying in the same inn, same lodge, same hotel. That night, while going to his room, Mr. Pickwick suddenly loses way. In the darkness of the night, he is not able to find his room. While moving through the corridor, he finds the door of a room open. He thinks that it is his own room and enters the room and starts undressing to go to the bed. After some time, a lady enters that room with a candle and finds Mr. Pickwick almost naked, and she is horrified and she starts shouting horribly. Mr. Pickwick somehow apologizes and leaves that room. The next morning, this supposed meeting between Peter Magnus and the lady to whom he is going to propose is to take place. Before this proposal meeting, Mr. Pickwick instructs Peter Magnus how he should propose to a lady. At that moment, the lady to whom Peter Magnus is to propose arrives there. This is the same lady in which room Mr. Pickwick has entered the previous night. And when this lady finds the same person, Mr. Pickwick, sitting in front with Mr. Peter Magnus, she lets out a horrible shriek, a horrible shout. Peter Magnus stands up and starts asking questions to that lady. He asks how he knows Mr. Pickwick. He claims that there is a relationship between that lady and Mr. Pickwick, and full of anger, Peter Magnus now invites Mr. Pickwick for a duel that evening and leaves that place. The lady is now horrified. She sees that a duel is going to take place between Peter Magnus and Mr. Samuel Pickwick. She plans to somehow stop this fight, and therefore she informs the local magistrate, the local mayor, the local judge, Mr. Napkins, about this future possible duel between these two persons. But while she informs the mayor, the judge, about this imminent duel fight between two persons, she only mentions the name of Mr. Samuel Pickwick, but she does not mention the name of Mr. Peter Magnus. Instead, she mentions the name of Mr. Snodgrass as the other person who would fight with Mr. Samuel Pickwick. And because of this complaint, Mr. Samuel Pickwick and Mr. Snodgrass are arrested by the messengers of the magistrate, the local mayor, Mr. Nupkins. Mr. Pickwick tries to explain the whole situation to Mr. Nupkins, but Mr. Nupkin was a person of rude in nature. He is not ready to listen to any plea, and he decides to hold the trial immediately. In the meantime, Sam Weller, while walking around in that place at Ipswich, suddenly finds that Job Trotter is coming out of the house of the mayor, Mr. Nupkins himself. So, he now has doubt that probably both Job Trotter and Mr. Alfred Jingle has been guests of the mayor, Mr. Nupkins. Sam immediately goes and informs this, narrates this to Mr. Samuel Pickwick. After coming to know about this, Mr. Samuel Pickwick requests a private talk, a private discussion with the mayor, Mr. Nupkins. And in that private discussion, Mr. Pickwick explains to Mr. Nupkins that the person who has been staying as his guest is not Mr. Charles Fitzmarshall, but it is actually a person called Alfred Jingle, a person of bad morality. Knowing the reality of Mr. Alfred Jingle, who has disguised himself, presented himself as Mr. Charles Fitzmarshall, and who has been there in the household of Mr. Nupkins as a rich suitor of Mr. Nupkins' daughter. Knowing this, after coming to know about this, the mayor, Mr. Nupkins, is very horrified. He is now quite shocked, and he wants somehow to save the respect of the whole family. Therefore, he immediately lets Mr. Pickwick and Mr. Snodgrass free, declaring that there is a mistake in their arrest, and he also does not take any action against Mr. Alfred Jingle, because if any action is taken against Alfred Jingle and Job Trotter, then the whole town of Ipswich would come to know about this scandal of a mayor giving shelter to a person of bad morality, to a cheat. After the Ipswich episode, Mr. Pickwick and Sam Weller and other Pickwickians, they come back to London, because they have been already informed that the case against Mr. Pickwick filed by Mrs. Bardell has to put in action, and the trial for the case is about to start. After reaching London, Mr. Pickwick plans first to leave Mrs. Bardell's house. Mr. Pickwick is very angry that Mrs. Bardell has taken him to the court, and it is also informed by Dickens that Mrs. Bardell has filed this case against Mr. Pickwick because she is tricked by the law firm of Dodson and Fogg, because the law firm of Dodson and Fogg thinks that it is a good opportunity to earn some money by filing this case against Mr. Pickwick. Therefore, Mr. Pickwick has been asked to appear in this trial. I have already discussed that Dickens in this novel criticizes and satirizes many social institutions. Dickens' satirical exposure of the legal system of law as an institution is one of the highlight of this novel. Through this episode of Mrs. Bardell's lawsuit against Mr. Pickwick and how Mrs. Bardell is tricked, influenced by the law firm Dodson and Fogg to file this case against Mr. Pickwick. Through this episode, Dickens highlights the fault lines in the contemporary legal system. Meanwhile, Mr. Pickwick, Sam Weller and other Pickwickians are invited by Mr. Wardle to Dingley Dell again to celebrate the Christmas. So, on the Christmas occasion, Pickwickians, the 4 Pickwickians and Sam Weller, they all again go back to Dingley Dell. There, Mr. Winkle gets introduced to another guest there. Her name is Arabella Allen, and a romantic relationship gradually develops between Mr. Winkle and Arabella Allen. Snodgrass also takes this opportunity to resume her relationship with Emily Wardle. Love blossoms between these two pairs of lovers. After the Christmas, they have to come back to London, and when they come back to London, Mr. Pickwick is informed that the trial for the case is about to start. Mr. Pickwick faces the trial. The lawyers for the petitioner present many witnesses to prove their case, to prove the case of Mrs. Bardell. The petitioner's advocate, whose name has been Sergeant Bosphorus, he presents many witnesses, and among the witnesses he calls the 3 Pickwickians, Tupman, Snodgrass and Winkle, and these witnesses are asked to narrate that episode in which they find Mr. Pickwick embracing, hugging Mrs. Bardell. The petitioner's lawyer Bosphorus also narrates the episode of Mr. Pickwick entering the room of an unknown lady in a hotel involving at Ipswich. That episode is also presented as a witness there, and how that episode has broken the marriage of a respectable lady. After some days, the trial gets over and the jury finally pronounce their judgment, and they decide that Mr. Pickwick has to pay £750 as compensation to Mrs. Bardell for the breach of promise of marriage, and Mr. Pickwick is given 2 months' time to pay this amount to Mrs. Bardell. Mr. Pickwick says he is not going to pay this amount, he is not going to give in surrender to this wrong decision, and he immediately decides that he would visit the nearby town of Bath. In this episode again, Dickens satirically exposes the legal system of the contemporary England. A person has to now pay, a judgment is given by the jury to pay £750 as compensation for the crime which he has not committed. And it gradually comes out that Mr. Pickwick has changed a great deal through all these adventures. He has been cheated by Mr. Jingle on more than one occasion, but all these experiences have contributed to the development of his character. And in this episode of his decision of not paying the amount to Mrs. Bardell, it is shown that Mr. Pickwick has developed to be a person of great principle. The principle that he is not going to succumb, he is not going to surrender to any wrong decision, any wrong. So, with this strength of mind, he decides that he would pass the 2 months time given by the court at a place called Bath. So, with this we have come to the second session of this summary of Dickens' novel Pickwick Papers. Thank you for watching.